Do you have something that you truly, relentlessly desire? Despite your state of life, is there something else that you would go completely to the end of the world to get? Well, lucky for you, there's a way to achieve what you're looking for, and you won't need to go to the end of the world to get it. But you will need to go somewhere, and the place may be too out of reach for some. It's not far away, closer than one may believe, but there are certain requirements that some individuals may not meet. First, whatever it is that you seek, know that you must seriously desire what you want. In your eyes, it should be something you need. If you begin the journey without the correct state of mind, you will surely fail, as it will be near impossible to turn back once the journey begins. The second requirement is that you need a vehicle of sort. Most use a car, as it's the most comfortable choice. There have been a select few that have used small motorized vehicles, such as an ATV or motorcycle, but this has proven to be quite difficult, as the conditions of the journey can prove to be too bothersome. Do not use a vehicle too large or noticeable, as you will need some cover of night to be most safe. Also, while any sort of car will do, you may not want to choose the most expensive or cherished vehicle. You can take your slick new black Mercedes for the drive if you'd like, but don't expect it to come out in a pristine state. Make sure your vehicle is completely fueled before beginning the drive. The first task to accomplish is to locate the road. It doesn't have a name, it's not on a map, and technically, it doesn't even exist. It will only show up if you're looking for it at the right time, and you will only spot it if you know what to look for. Finally, you must be alone during the journey. You didn't think you'd be able to go with the group now, did you? It must be night when you begin. Choose the time of night where you believe the roads are the least populated. Drive to any area that is just a stretch of road surrounded by woods. Here's where you want to start paying close attention. If you're looking for the road, it will turn up eventually, but you need to search for the road's hint in order to pull down the right one. Once you're close, you will see or feel its signs, but what signs will be depends on what your desire is. For example, if you're in search of wealth, you may spot shimmers on the empty branches of trees, as if they resemble the shine of gold or diamonds. If you seek love, you may begin to see rose petals slowly dance in the light breeze, blowing in the road's direction. If you seek revenge, you might sense an ever-growing feeling of heat or anger in your body as you approach. Just know what it is you really want, and you'll have no problem finding the turn. Once you're sure you've found the revealed road, take a deep breath and turn down onto it. At this point, you have officially started down the nameless road, which brings you through 7 miles, leading to whatever it is you seek. Each mile will test your desire and will expose if you really do want what you're searching for. Before you go any further, stop the car and be wary of a few advisements. Do not turn on the radio during the drive. Do not use a phone during the drive. Do not open the windows during the drive. Make sure they are closed before you continue. If you are riding a vehicle without windows or a top, then prepare for the worst, as the odds are heavily stacked against you. Do not attempt to leave your vehicle at any time. You'll never want to exceed 30 miles per hour, unless you're desperate to make it through a section of the road. And most importantly, as with any drive, buckle up. Feel free to prepare and make sure you're ready. Once the road has been entered, time has stopped, so you don't need to worry about losing the night. Though you may not notice, you're not actually in your own world anymore. Take one last moment to realize that once the first mile is over, there's no turning back. If you ponder turning back at all, know that you shouldn't even be on the journey in the first place. Once all is done, start continuing on the road. On the first mile, you won't see much change. The road passes through mostly woods, with a few miles being an exception. The air will turn a bit colder, in which you should turn on your heating system if the vehicle has one. You won't want to take your eyes off the road later. Take some time to calm any uneasiness by admiring some of the night sky. You'll see it completely lined with the stars, more than what you would ever believe possible. If the weather was cloudy beforehand, you'll also notice that the sky is now clear. On the second mile, the air will become even colder. This is primarily the reason why traveling in an open vehicle is very difficult. With each mile, the air will drop in temperature, even if the season should be warm. If the air is too cold to bear, even with the heat on, your only option is to speed up. With each mile, the road also becomes more complex, taking more turns and showing an increasing amount of road hazards. Be sure to always keep focused on the road in front of you, in order to avoid as many bumps or obstacles as possible. Hitting a few rocks and potholes won't hamper your progress too much, but you'll want to keep in the best condition for as long as possible. If your vehicle is forced to stop because of damage, then there's nothing left you can do but eventually freeze to death. On the third mile, you may begin to spot silhouettes of human figures in the lining of the trees. Pay no attention to them, even if they seem to get closer. It will be hard to resist peeking at their unnerving, distant appearance, but know that they will eventually reveal themselves later. At this mile, the road will become dirt if you weren't already driving on it in the beginning. Keep to the center of the path, as it will become narrow and wide at random intervals. On a quick side note, you should never attempt to turn around. You'll be left on a path which never ends. You would simply run out of fuel eventually, and be left to freeze in the cold conditions. On the fourth mile, you will not only see more of the figures, but you will begin to, in a sense, hear them. In the back of your mind, a very faint, unintelligible whisper will echo. These will come and go, but you can't stop them. If they become too bothersome or distracting, try and tune them out by thinking of what it is you desire. Attempting to listen and determine what the voices are saying will only attract them to you, and you want to be as far away from them as you can. They'll be closer later, so there's no use in bringing them near you this early. On the fifth mile, you will come to a clearing. The lining of trees to your left will disappear, to reveal a lake with no end, and a beaming great moon over the water. The illumination from the moon will be so spectacular that your vehicle's headlights will no longer be required. Restrain yourself from gazing at it. If you look at its light for even more than a few seconds, the road in front of you will end, throwing your vehicle into the water, in which you will freeze in mere minutes. The voices will be gone for this mile, but don't rejoice yet. They'll be back. On the sixth mile, take into account that you are more than halfway done. Despite the progress, you may lose hope here. The stars will have disappeared at this point, leaving the sky an empty black abyss. The clearing will have ended, leading you back into the woods. The only light you will have will be provided by your vehicle's headlights, but they will flicker from time to time, even if you're sure they're in perfect working order. If you have a radio in the vehicle, it will turn on here automatically. If you didn't turn it off beforehand, it will produce an overwhelming screech that will send you off the path. A calm voice will then begin to speak about your greatest fears, what it is you absolutely fear in your life. It will speak in a way that will cause you to visualize the words in your mind, so don't listen to it. If you begin to comprehend what it's saying, the horrors will prove too much for you to stay on the road safely. Attempting to turn off the radio will prove no use. Speed up if you need to. Just keep your mind off the voices as much as you can. As you approach the end of the mile, the voice will fade out of the speakers, leaving your ears at peace. For now. On the 7th mile, the voices from the figures will return. It won't sound like a whisper this time, but more like distant screams, growing closer with each second. At some point on this mile, you'll hear one of them in your ear, as if one of them were right behind you. This is because one of the figures have found their way into your vehicle. Do not turn around. Their faces will shock you to paralysis, leading you off the road. If you do not draw attention to it, it will become uninterested and hopefully leave. These beings are said to be the one who have traveled down this road before, but were not successful. They lived the remainder of their existence suffering in the darkness, with their only goal of being to bring other travelers down with them. It has been said from experience that these beings can't physically harm you, so as long as they don't cause you to wreck, you should be fine. On the 8th mile, the road here takes very sharp turns, which if overshot, will lead you to throw the vehicle into a pit through the trees. The cold is near fatal here. If you were going to have a glass or bottle of liquid in your vehicle, it would appear solid in mere seconds. The heating system will have become completely obsolete. Your headlights will flicker more, sometimes shutting off for a few seconds. You should brake if this happens, but do not completely stop. The figures will be following you at this point, and you should not stop for too long. They will surround and trap your vehicle. More of their screams can be heard from outside your doors, sometimes even sounding of maniacal laughter. Their hands will claw at your windows, desperate to reach in and feel something living. Do not look at them. They won't block your windshield, and the last thing you want to happen is to crash and be trapped with them. If you don't make it from here, pray that it's the freezing that ends you. On the 9th mile, your vehicle will stall, the headlights will shut off, as will all other systems inside. There's nothing you can do to prevent this. What you will need to do is close your eyes and immediately attempt to restart the vehicle. Keep your eyes closed, as the figures would have surely surrounded you at this point. The starting of the vehicle will frighten them, and they will all back away temporarily. This will give you a chance to start moving forward again. If you begin to hear the windows crack from their struggle, don't lose focus. The beings can alter the vehicle, but remember that they still do not have the strength to physically affect you. You will hear nothing but their voices rampage in your mind, as there could be anywhere between a dozen or 100 of them after you now. Once you start the vehicle, floor it. Floor it so long as you can stay on the path. When the mile's done, the beings will retreat. On the 10th mile, the voices of the beings will stop. If you were to look in your rearview mirror, you'll see them following you, but not as if they were chasing. They're watching you, as if they were seeing you off. As you go down the 10th mile, the road will be smoother, as if you were back on the 1st mile. The figures will be lining the sides of the path ahead of you. They won't be after you, but they will watch as you pass. Some have theorized that the beings are impressed here, that you have come a long way on the journey to what you desire. This is false. They are not impressed, but they are happy. They are happy you are about to approach the next mile. They are happy because you are most likely going to your death. On the 11th and final mile, everything in your vehicle will lose power, as it did on the 9th mile. The vehicle would normally be immobile, but you will still be moving. An unknown force will be pulling you forward. In the darkness, you will see a glowing red light up ahead, as if it were a light at the end of a tunnel. Close your eyes and cover them. Do whatever it takes to make sure you do not see what you are about to go through. Covering your ears would also be helpful, but keeping your eyes covered should be the higher priority. The red light is another clearing, but there's no moon or lake this time. Once it's entered, unrelenting and inconceivable noises will sound from all directions. No amount of bravery and conditioning will spare you from these sounds. The cold will turn to a merciless heat, burning all parts of the vehicle. You will feel the illusion of the flesh being burned off your bones, that every part of you is being destroyed as you travel through the screams and audible suffering. As long as you keep your eyes closed and resist the urge to see where you are, you will survive through the suffering. This will last a total of 31 seconds, but many fail to keep their vision closed during that time and are left to the worst fate of the road. Where is this mile located? Those who have survived do not know. Some have named it the transmission from hell, but whether it's part of hell is debatable. After the final mile, power will return. Stop the vehicle. Take a moment to possibly regain some of your sanity. Let the screaming in your ears begin to fade, and know that you have nearly completed your journey, with the hardest task overcome. Breathe, and begin to drive forward once again. After only a kilometer, your vehicle will arrive at a dead end. Stop here, and don't attempt to move again. Nothing will happen right this second, but do not be disappointed. Relax and close your eyes. Imagine in your mind what it is you've desired the entire time. It will most likely still be the same as when you entered, but with some, this desire may actually change through making this journey. Think about what it is that you went through, such terrifying and difficult means to acquire, and imagine possessing it in your hands. Once you have completely visualized this, slowly open your eyes. You will then find yourself at the beginning of the unnamed road, where you first began. This may confuse you, but know that you are finished. Your task is done. Your mind will then return to your reward. If what you desired was material, check in the back seat, or in the trunk if the object is larger. If the object was small enough, it might already be in your pocket. If what you desired was non-material, then do not be disappointed if the change is not immediate. Turn back to where you came from, and you will find in your life that what you wanted is there. You may have found the love of your dreams. You may have gained unnatural, unimaginable power. You may have put your most hated enemy to the most satisfying revenge possible. You will have no doubt gained what you deserved. So now that the task is done, what's the catch? Is your vehicle cursed? Is there something you're about to lose? Is your death imminent? The answer to all is no, of course. You've done the challenge. You've proved worthy to what you desire. As stated before, the sounds of the 11th mile will continue to exist in your mind, potentially causing you some vivid and unusual nightmares, but these should prove as nothing compared to what you've gained. Now, one last question. Is there something else you desire? Are you not yet satisfied? After all, you're right back where you started. The road's right in front of you. So are you up for another drive? If so, buckle up and just move forward. The clock on my dash reads 4:30 a.m. The darkness outside of my headlights is so thick that I can't see anything to the left or right of me. There isn't a star in the sky, and the moon is eerily absent. The phone call I received last night assured me, though, that the church in Havens Creek is nice, and the congregation was wonderful. I wanted to get there early, get the lay of the land, and put my own little flair to the place. I'd been driving for some time when I finally came up to my turn for the church. I pulled into the parking lot, and what my high beams fell onto absolutely took my breath away. A large, beautiful white church with long columns, a bright red double door, and beautifully stained glass windows with depictions of our Lord and Savior. I stepped out of the car, turning off the headlights, and the night was heavy again. Outside of the interior lights of the church and the solar-powered lights lining the path to the door, I could see nothing. I'll admit, I felt a bit unsettled, but my mentor, Father Reynard, had me come here as a guest pastor, and I was not going to let him down. I made my way up the stairs and into the church. The inside was even more glorious than outside. 50 yards of pews lined down both sides, and a gold-lined red carpet from the door to the pulpit. Getting the full view of the stained glass, I see our Lord and Savior, the cross, our Virgin Mary, cherubs with wings, and the angels up above. Just being inside this place filled my heart with love. I made my way down the gold-lined carpet and to the first pew. I took a seat to relax and just take it all in. Directly next to me was a book I'd come to know very well over my 40 years of life. The Bible. I picked up the very pristine book and sat it in my lap with my hands folded, rested on top of it, and took a deep breath. At this point, I was just trying to take it all in when I heard the front door open. The person's feet sounded hard off the floor with each step, which was strange, seeing as the way up was thickly carpeted. Each step drew nearer and nearer to me, until finally, a man came into view. He was extremely handsome and well-dressed. A black suit jacket and pants, with a red vest, and a black tie with red lacy inlays. The man had long blonde hair pulled back out of his face, and an air of authority about him that I just couldn't place. The man walked past me and removed a chair from the rack and walked back towards me. He sat the chair directly in front of me, sat down, and crossed one leg over the other. We both stared at each other in silence for a short time, and just as I was about to speak up, he said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." His voice rolled out like honey, sweet, yet sinister. I stared back at him. This isn't how we usually do things at my church, I thought to myself. But I am a guest in this house, so I won't push. "What is your name, my child?" I asked the man sitting in front of me. He cocked his head to the side and smiled. "You can call me Sam. Father?" He held out the word, so I knew it was a question. "Ah," I replied. "Salazar. Father Marcielo Salazar." He gave me a slight smile, and his bright blue eyes shone vibrantly. "It's very nice to meet you, Father Salazar. As I said before, my name is Sam, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could assist me. I have sinned, and I fear I may wind up in hell." I shook my head softly. "Oh, my child, do not worry. Our Father is a forgiving God. Please tell me what burdens you, so I may absolve you of your sins." Sam adjusted his seat, uncrossed his legs, and crossed them the other way. "I drink in excess, and then judge others in church when they admit to doing the same." I nodded. "Well, my child," I said. Sam quickly cut me off and continued. "When I was married, I would have my wife stay at her mother's house when she was on her period." I looked at him as I tried to assure him that the Bible speaks of it being a time of uncleanliness. Sam quickly cut me off again. "I sent my son off to a conversion camp when he came out as homosexual." I didn't respond this time, and he continued. "I raised my hand to my wife if she tried to leave the house in anything other than modest clothing. I wanted my wife to be modest, but I also received less than modest photographs from my 19-year-old babysitter, Brittany." My eyes widened, and I stood up from the pew I was sitting in. I stepped around the side and began to back away down the aisle towards the door. His soft look hardened in an instant. His bright blue eyes went from soft to dangerous. "What's wrong, Father?" He spat at me. "You look awful." This man was speaking my life back to me. "Who are you, and what do you want?" My hands and voice were both shaking. I was backing up steadily, and Sam was just staring at me. We were far enough apart that if I turned for the door, I should be right there. I turned to look over my shoulder at the door, and when I turned back, I was right in front of the church again, face to face with Sam. My eyes widened. "What is this? What's going on?" I looked around and looked up at the ceiling. All of the stained glass depictions were staring at me, and they looked angry. "What does it look like, Father?" Sam said. "You're being judged." I looked around frantically. "Judged? Are you God?" I immediately dropped to my knees and bowed my head. I heard Sam scoff. "God?" He laughed. "You believe a man who led a life such as yours would be judged by my Father?" I raised my head and stared up at him. "Your Father?" I was confused. I ran through my knowledge of Scripture as fast as I could, and it came to me. I looked deep into his eyes and said the only thing I could think of. "Samuel." The man smiled a big toothy grin. I stared in horror. "I'm dead." Sam winked at me. "I applaud you, Marcielo. It takes most of you so much longer to come to that conclusion." "Wait, this can't be," I stammered. "The devil himself, Lucifer. I may not have been the greatest man during my life, but I followed the Bible as close as I could. I kept my wife in modest clothing, sent her away during her time of uncleanliness, and tried to have my son reborn in the eyes of the Lord. I did falter in my marriage a bit, but how has that earned me an audience with the devil? Sam let out a long, deep laugh. You know, my dear priest, he said. Some say that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. But I assure you, I have done no such thing. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, dear priest, is convincing the world that the Bible is the Word of God. I stared at him, mouth agape, and my mind running overtime. What do you mean, Sam? I felt on the verge of tears. I mean, I wrote the book that you people flock to. You see, my dear priest, many, many, many years ago, my father created humanity. He loved you with all of his heart and swore that humanity would be perfect. I assured him that no creature with free will would ever be so. He assured me of the contrary, and for the first time in its long life, the devil struck a deal with none other than God himself. I told him that I would add but one thing to this world that would prove the downfall of humanity, and if they proved unfit, he would see me as his right hand. He assured me that it wasn't possible, that humanity was pure and perfect. Now, that book has existed in many forms depending on who holds it, but I wrote them all. I never appeared to Adam and Eve as a snake, but a book bound in snake skin did. I told them of the beauty that lay outside, the glory, the happiness. It spoke of just eating that fruit and experiencing it all. Then, as the first bite was taken, I had won. My father was furious. My brother was bloodthirsty. So began a war in heaven, and my fall from grace. I stared at this man, this being, as he turned everything I thought I knew upside down. Did you not stop and think as to why your loving, malevolent God would have bears turned on children? Why he'd destroy cities full of people in holy fire, or flood the world committing genocide? I stared at him. Because, I said, God's wrath is terrible, but his love is infinite. It was for the greater good, so humanity could be reborn. Sam spoke up. No, not quite. Just a little smoke and mirrors on my end, to put the fear of God in humanity, you know? Sam tilted his head back and laughed again. You people used this book to mask your bigotry and hate, not knowing that one day, your undying soul will land right here on my doorstep. Since humanity's initial birth, I haven't persuaded a single soul to do anything. I haven't had to. That whole, the devil made me do it, it's a crock of shit. The things I wrote made it normal for people to hear voices about murdering their children. Oh, it's God's will. Nope, hi. Sorry again. That's mental illness. Sam looked at me serious and spoke again. Do you believe God makes mistakes? I stood and faced him, headstrong in my conviction. No, I do not, I said, my voice no longer shaking. He stepped forward, almost nose to nose. Then why is it, my dear priest, that you tried to change one of God's creations because it didn't fit your narrative? I took an involuntary step back as he continued. I wrote that book with the idea in mind that hypocrisy would surge. It's laden with enough truth and love to lead the stupid astray. My father loves all life, all things, no matter color or gender. The part about stoning those that lay with the same sex, all me. You hypocrites line my doorstep like lambs to slaughter. That love you feel well up inside when you tell somebody they'll burn in hell for who they love, or living their life not according to your broken vision of an almighty God. It's not love at all, but your soul's acceptance of your truly wicked nature. I clutched the Bible to my chest and just shook my head. No, you are the father of lies. None of this is true. Sam smiled again. Is that what you believe, my dear priest? If so, have a look at the book you so coveted all your life. I pulled the Bible away from my chest and looked down at it, a snakeskin cover, with a 6-winged angel ablazoned on the cover. Sam seemed to stare into my soul. This, my dear priest, is the book that Eve held in her hands when she decided to take that first bite. I opened the book to a language I'd never seen before. Sam looked at me quizzically and turned his head to the side. Huh, he said. My apologies. You can't read Enotion. He waved his hand, and the book glowed white hot. I dropped it immediately and took another step back. I couldn't understand this. If what he was saying was true, my entire life had been a lie. But wait, hold on. What about before the birth of Jesus Christ? Before Christianity? I stammered. Ah, you will find my handiwork in the hieroglyphics, in the halls of ancient Rome, or the diaries of Julius Caesar. I had heard enough. I couldn't take it anymore. Tears openly fell down my cheeks. Now, for my questions, my dear priest. How does it feel knowing that I robbed you of all your earthly desires, only to have your soul remain in hell for eternity? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even form clear sentences in my head. How does it feel knowing that the wife you detested so much took your son, denounced your wicked ways, and will both thrive for eternity in my Father's kingdom? I felt his hand touch my shoulder, and it burned like nothing I'd ever felt before. I screamed out in agony. As for my final question, this one won't be directed at you, my dear priest, but for our little eavesdroppers here. So tell me, my dear listener, when was the last time you went to church? The car accident was a blur, a symphony of shrapnel flying across the highway, the debris of at least 3 vehicles. At the time, I didn't know who was at fault or what exactly happened. I just knew pain, immense, searing pain, all over. I was in and out of consciousness for a while, but I can put together a picture of the following hours, however murky. The moments I do remember will forever be etched into my memory. I first came to on a gurney in the hospital, rushing through a brightly lit hallway. There was some chatter about my condition, but none of it was promising. A simple but ominous sentiment from a nurse stuck out like a sore thumb, and stayed with me until I was sprawled out in the operating room. This doesn't look good. Shaking on the table, I recall more bright lights, as well as the beeping of medical machinery on either side of me. Many doctors and nurses were at my side, scrambling to keep me alive. Though my mind was an utter mess, I do remember thinking that this was the end of my story. Between the intense injuries and the panicked doctors, I knew death was right around the corner, waiting to take me. My life didn't flash before me, and I didn't think of my loved ones left behind. There wasn't enough time for that. I simply succumbed to the endless slumber and closed my eyes as the flat line rang through the room. My eyes were fogged, but I could make out the shape of a tunnel ahead. At its end, a light. I made my way to it, cautious but curious. Eventually, I reached the glow and my vision returned. I was in a bright room. Before me, a tall older gentleman in a white robe standing at a podium. He beckoned for me to come over and spoke with enthusiasm. "Hello, newcomer. Welcome to heaven." He gestured toward the wall behind him. There were no pearly white gates, just a minimalist red door, void of any knobs or handles. "Heaven? So, I'm dead?" The man smiled. "Yes, indeed you are. But fret not, for this is heaven, a paradise of the afterlife. Would you like to enter?" I was disappointed that my life was over, but I knew it was inevitable, given the circumstances. At the very least, heaven was seemingly real, and I had been accepted. Yes, I would like to enter. I stepped forward, but the man placed his hand on my chest, stopping me. Before you can enter the world above, an offering is required. I was confused. An offering? Of what sort? The man smiled again. "We need your skin." My face contorted in dismay. My skin? But why? "I can't provide specifics. Just know that it will be too cumbersome for you on your journey. Don't worry. The removal is a mostly harmless procedure." Mostly? The man removed a thin silver utensil from his robe and grabbed my forearm. He began carving, to which I pulled away. "I'm not removing your skin. That's above my pay grade. I'm just marking you for our records. I have to dig deep enough to engrave your muscle tissue. Please don't move." I reluctantly allowed him to continue. The pain was severe, but it was nothing compared to the injuries I sustained in the accident. When it was over, I looked down to see a string of unrecognizable characters, along with the numbers that made up my birthday. 03/04/1991. The man pushed the red door open and stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. I asked one more question before progressing. "Are you an angel?" The man pondered for a moment before replying. "I prefer celestial overseer, but if that term suits you, then yes, I am an angel." He motioned again for me to enter, though not completely satisfied with his answer. I obliged. The door was swiftly shut behind me, leaving me to survey the area. It was a room, similar to the previous, only void of anything other than myself. I was confused as I walked to its center. Was heaven a plain white room? Was something supposed to happen? Just as I was about to go back to the red door, the unthinkable happened. I was launched upward at a great speed. If I had to guess, my velocity was akin to that of a meteor hurtling through deep space before meeting Earth's skies. In a matter of moments, I began burning up, a blue flame filling my field of view before turning orange, then red. As my speed increased, so too did the pain. It was like I was in the hospital again, dying of irreparable damage. What was happening? Was I reliving the pain of my death? My ascent continued, and with it, a deadly realization. I wasn't just burning. With great difficulty, I was able to tilt my head and gaze upon myself. My skin was peeling. I watched in horror as it left my body completely, slipping into the great white abyss below. All that was left was my muscle tissue. Soon after, the flame subsided, and my motion slowed. Steam surrounded me as I landed in a new location. Though experiencing an insurmountable burning sensation, I was still conscious and aware. Alive, if you could even call it that. It was hard to focus on anything but the sharp sting enveloping me, but I was able to comprehend my whereabouts. It was an endless white void. Within it, a plethora of bodies scattered about, skinless humanoid forms writhing in pain, covered only in red connective tissue, much like my own. They left blood trails as they crawled and slid across the white floor. My knees quickly gave out, and I too laid down in agony, unable to fight the anguish any longer. I desperately crawled to the nearest individual and spoke with what little energy I had left. What is this? Is this supposed to be heaven? Why did they take our skin? The grotesque red face of a person looked up at me and cried. They wear it. A shiver danced across the length of my spine. What? Who wears it? Before I could receive a response, an electric shock filled my body and jolted me awake. I was once again in the hospital on the operating table, somehow living, albeit barely. I tried to stay afloat, but I wound up drifting away into the bliss of a painless sleep. I awoke in a bed, bandaged up from head to toe. My injuries still stung, but not quite as much as before. A nurse assured me that I was okay, and very lucky to be alive. Recalling my experience and unable to see most of my body, I had to ask her, "My skin, do I still have my skin?" She chuckled. "Of course you do. Some of it will be scarred, but rest assured, it's still there." I sighed in relief, knowing my trip to heaven was just a strange, medicine and shock-induced nightmare. Thank goodness. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I was finally able to go home, that I would discover something terrible about my wounds. I've told some about my near-death experience, but never the following, for fear of what conclusions might be drawn about my sanity. My first day back was peaceful. I relaxed and enjoyed my quaint life, happy it wasn't ripped away from me in an untimely manner. My next couple of nights, however, were anything but quaint. During my second night home, I woke up in a fit of sleep paralysis, my bedroom soaked in darkness and warmer than usual. There, standing at the foot of my bed, dimly lit by a sliver of moonlight coming through the window, was the tall man from heaven. His plain stoic expression was broken up only by the occasional grin, a malevolent smile that made my skin crawl beneath the blankets. The spike in adrenaline was not enough for me to break free of my chemical restraints. I was forced to endure his presence and watch in terror as he walked to my side and spoke. It wasn't always this way, you know. He was now close enough to me to feel an intense heat that his body seemed to give off. Heaven truly was a remarkable place, a world where mortals spent their afterlives in peace. The man grabbed my wrist. It burned, but I was unable to react. Thousands of years of routine breeds a fierce boredom. We were bored up there, never knowing what it was like where humans roamed. A need grew within us, a craving to explore the world outside of our realm. He picked off a piece of melted flesh and waved it under his nose like a glass of wine, inhaling the aroma. Our forms don't bode well in Earth's air. Your skin is the only thing that tempers the reaction. Otherwise, we would break down and disintegrate. He spread the piece of flesh onto his arms, creating a thin layer of protective paste. The heat dissipated. You've been marked. We need you back. We locked eyes, his head tilting slowly in observation as I futilely attempted to scream. His face lowered to meet mine. Tremors erupted throughout my body. Still, I couldn't move. Then suddenly, he vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving me alone in the darkness. Once the man disappeared, I was able to move again. I felt my wrist, and it was fine. No missing skin. However disturbing this incident was, I knew that it had to be a remnant of my dream from the hospital, a side effect of the trauma I suffered, nothing more than a reoccurring, albeit terrifying nightmare. Regardless of this explanation, I was unable to sleep until daybreak. The next night was stranger still. After brushing my teeth and looking up at the bathroom mirror, I saw something that shook me to my core. It was me, but without skin. A horrific amalgamation of red, muscly tendons made up my facial structure. Behind me, the tall man, his voice echoing off the bathroom walls. Come back to us. I fell back into the wall. The man was not there. When I looked at the mirror again, the sight was a normal one. I chalked this up to being another troubled facet of my psyche, post-car crash. It was clear at this point that I was severely troubled. I started entertaining the idea of seeking professional help in the form of a psychologist. The next night, however, disproved all previous theories about my bizarre state of affairs. Upon peeling back the bandages on my arm to bathe for the first time, I saw it. There were scars in odd, unrecognizable shapes, as well as a familiar numeric sequence. 03, 04, 1991. I was just a kid. I didn't know any better. Even if I could go back, what would I have done differently? Could I have changed what happened? Could I have done anything at all? Probably not. Even so, I can't help but dwell on the details. Some nights, it keeps me from sleeping. I can only hope that sharing my tale will help ease the burden. I don't remember much about my childhood before my mother passed away. My dad told me that she was struck by a car on her way to work. I was only 4 years old. Still, I know that I loved her. Part of me still does. It's a strange, lingering feeling that doesn't go away. As much as I loved her, I feel that my father loved her even more. I say this because my mother's death took an immense toll on him. Up until I was about 10 years of age, he would have a nervous breakdown, tears and all, at least once a month. He never told me why, but I knew it was because of her. Things changed a bit my 10th year. We moved out of that house, the one that reminded us of her. My dad pulled me out of the school system, and we moved into a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. It may seem a bit drastic, but it was clear that my father needed a change. He wasn't doing so well. Because of this, I didn't question his actions. From that point on, we lived a simple life. My dad took odd jobs here and there, and seeing as we lived up north, selling firewood was sufficient enough to supplement our income. That was my job. I would go out each morning with my dad's old axe and chop some wood logs for our eager customers. It wasn't much of a life, but it was good enough for us. Comfortable with our new living situation, I was taken completely off guard one night when I heard the sound of crying coming from my father's room. We had been doing so well, so why was he still in such dire straits? Before I could analyze the situation any further, I heard my dad get up and slam the door shut on his way out of the cabin. I was compelled to follow him. Peering out of the cabin's entrance, I saw my dad storm off into the woods, bringing with him an acoustic guitar. I'd seen the guitar before, and I knew my dad used to play, but I'd never seen him handle the thing. I figured that those years were behind him. Curious as to what he was up to, I followed him into the forest. I tiptoed, making sure to hide behind trees and avoid stepping on leaves as I went. Eventually, we came to a small clearing with a creek running through it. Near the creek was a stump, where my dad sat down and adjusted until he was comfortable. He looked down at his guitar, closed his eyes, and began playing. I stood in awe of what I was hearing, a haunting mixture of melodious vocals and the rustling of the trees in the wind filled the forest. I knew he played, but I never knew he could sing. It was breathtaking, for lack of a better word. This went on as often as my dad had breakdowns in our previous house. Each night it happened, I would follow my dad out to the woods and listen to the beautiful song he'd seemingly written. I don't know what it meant, but I can tell even at age 10 that it stemmed from a place of great pain. I could tell that somber, heartfelt tune was about losing a loved one. Whenever I tried to picture my mother, the image was always blurry and out of focus, almost as if what little memory I had of her was slipping away. Whenever my dad played his song, I could picture her crystal clear. It was the oddest thing. This brought me comfort and ultimately helped me come to terms with her death. I had hoped at the time that it was doing the same for him. Being 10 years old, though, it was hard to tell what was going through an adult's mind. Many months passed. The routine was nice for a while, but one night, everything changed. I heard the usual swing of the cabin door, followed by a swift crack against the door frame. It was very loud, signaling for me that my father was more distressed than usual. I hastily made my way to the door in an effort to follow him, but I stopped for a moment when passing his bedroom. The door was open just enough for me to see the guitar leaning up against his bed. How peculiar. I wondered why he left it behind. In truth, there was only one way to find out. My dad was already at the creek when I arrived. He sat on the stump, motionless and quiet. He was in a sulking position, and his eyes were closed. Without his guitar or voice, the forest around him was void of sound. The only thing I could hear was the water in the creek as it trickled by us. Soon enough, my father began singing. I could tell it was the same song he'd always sung, but it sounded off. Without his guitar, his voice was muddy and out of tune. There were some awkward highs and lows that made my stomach hurt. Though his eyes were shut, I saw tears forcing their way out and watched as they swam down his cheeks. Eventually, he stopped singing and broke down crying. What happened in the following moments will stay with me forever. As my father wept, something strange happened. A milky white fog danced across the water. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but eventually, the white smoke gathered above the creek and took shape right before my very eyes. It was a spirit. No ordinary spirit, mind you. It was my mother. My father stopped crying and instead began shivering. He opened his eyes and looked up to see the specter. He almost fell backward in fear. The ghost of my mother reached out and began choking my father. His face went from red to blue before my mom stopped. He fell to the ground and vigorously gasped for air. I couldn't bring myself to lend a helping hand. I was stuck in a petrified state. My father tried to crawl away, but it was to no avail. My mother began clawing away at him. She tore through his clothes and eventually through his skin. I watched in horror as she reached into his body and ripped out his vital organs. His bones snapped like branches. His blood tainted the water. His voice once again filled the forest. Only now it was screams of agony. I couldn't bear to watch any longer, so I closed my eyes. With my eyes shut, I remembered the song my dad sang. I started humming it to myself, and just like that, I calmed down. The world around me became quiet. All I could think about was the song, that beautiful tune. Memories of my parents came through the floodgates as I hummed. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I couldn't help but break down. What had my childhood become? Where was I going to go from here? Eventually, I stopped humming and opened my eyes. The apparition of my mother was gone. My dad's open corpse lay on the stump where he used to sing. As the scene before me sunk in, so did my heart. It crawled into the pit of my stomach and made a nest. It would stay there for many years to come. I don't remember running back to the cabin, nor do I recall calling the local authorities. What I do remember is the look on their faces where they took me back out there to what I had seen. The sight of my father's body was a grisly one, that's for sure. It was unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Still, it was taken care of in a swift and respectful fashion. In the coming months, the investigation came to an end. The true cause of my father's death was never determined, but that doesn't mean there were no answers found. My mother's body was discovered buried beneath the creek. My father's axe was determined to be the murder weapon. One of the theories floating around town was that my dad was the jealous type. They think he convinced himself my mom was having an affair, and then he lost his mind. Feeling guilty, he moved us out near the dump site so we could be closer to her. I guess I'll never know the full story, but one thing is for certain. My mother had her revenge. Everyone knows the story of Bloody Mary, and everyone knows how to summon her. Say her name 3 times in front of a mirror with the lights off. Of course, there are slight variations to the exact story depending on where you live, but it's all basically the same, right? My school was no different. A bunch of us kids in the 7th grade would gather up in the bathroom at least once a week, turn off the lights, and say her name 3 times. Of course nothing happened, but I always kept my eyes squeezed closed, so even if something did happen, I wouldn't have seen it. We were a bit morbid, thinking back on it. I knew that it wouldn't work, but I also knew that we shouldn't be tempting fate. The urban legend states that she would kill you or scratch your eyes out, so why exactly would we have even wanted to try to summon her? I guess kids do stupid things when they're young, but that's no excuse for how far it went. Like I said, it started with a bunch of us in the 7th grade doing the ritual in the bathroom closet to our 4th period class. The 6 of us had all met in 4th period at the beginning of the year, and since 4th period was right before lunch, we would all slip away and do our ritual without being bothered. Bloody Mary, or Mary as we begin to call her, became almost like a long-lost friend of ours. I don't think that my friends knew that I kept my eyes closed though, and I wasn't about to tell them that it was possibly my fault that none of this was working. Nothing happened over the span of a few months. No Mary appearance, although we tried a bunch of variations. At least, until the day that the somewhat leader of our little group, Cassie, ran up to meet me in a huff outside before school started. "Hey, Nikki, I found a real way to get Mary to appear. I've already told the others, but we've got to meet at the outside bathroom by the pavilions to make it work." I tried to question, to protest, but the bell had rung and she was already walking away. "Just meet us there, okay?" she called over her shoulder. The bathroom by the pavilions was the worst. It wasn't connected to the main school building, so it had no AC and, even worse, no inside lights. The light was provided only by a single flickering bulb and small grates that allowed the sunlight to filter in. And to top it off, the whole place smelled like a porta potty. The outside bathroom was truly awful. But I did as I was told and met the girls right after the bell rang for lunch. Instead of turning the light off immediately though, Cassie gathered us up in front of the row of sinks, gesturing to the middle sink in the row of 5. She said, "I finally figured it out. My brother's girlfriend came over the other night, and she said that she and her friends were able to see Mary here." "And she lived? Why here instead of any other mirror? What did she say happened?" Bethany, Nia, and Erica all spoke at once, and Cassie waved a dismissive hand. She didn't go into so much detail, because my parents were out and she was going into my brother's room. But she said that we first have to acknowledge Mary's baby, and then it'll work. "Mary's baby?" I asked, not quite understanding, but definitely not wanting anything to do with the ghost baby. "Yeah, that's what she said. It'll take a few days, but she said it'll work for sure." "Okay, how do we do it then?" Nia chimed in from the back. I was already somewhat apprehensive, being in the very isolated and very creepy outside bathroom, but I felt my stomach immediately drop when Cassie said, "First, we have to summon Mary's baby." My body wanted to instantly flee, and I wished that I had trusted my instincts. Instead, I stayed silent and let Nia ask, "Wait, I thought that Mary killed her babies, didn't she?" "Well, yeah, but in death she still wants them, I guess." "Okay, so how do we do this baby thing, and why do we have to do it here?" Erica asked, her nose scrunching up at the smell. Cassie sighed and said, "I don't know. Tyler's girlfriend said something about the baby being born prematurely and being stuffed down this sink without anyone knowing." Bethany opened her mouth to say something, but Cassie continued, "I know, okay? I know it sounds dumb, but she said it worked, and what we've been doing hasn't, so we can at least try it, right?" We all shrugged in agreement, and after looking at each of us directly, Cassie began again. Okay, so first, we have to have the water on, cold water only. She turned on the tap, then pointed at Bethany, who was closest to the door. Then lock the door and turn the light off. When Bethany did so, Cassie instructed us all to gather in front of the dirty mirror above the running middle sink. Okay, now hold your arms like you're holding a little baby. Look straight into the mirror and rock your arms back and forth while I say the words. We should feel a weight in our arms, and then we have to release it over the sink like Mary did. Are you guys ready? She looked at our glared reflections in the mirror, gave a nod in response to our own nods, and began to recite. Baby blue, your mommy's gone away. Baby blue, please come here to stay. Baby blue, we'll care for you. We're sorry your mommy could not. Baby blue, please come to us. We promise that you won't rot. Baby blue, your mommy's gone, but we will heal your pain. Baby blue, please come to us. Your mommy is insane. The rhyme itself was disturbing, but even worse was the squeal that rang out from the faucet almost as soon as Cassie had finished reciting. Surely it was the sound of a whining pipe, but it sounded sort of like a baby crying. Now, Cassie yelled, and we all released our arms and bolted toward the door. Once safely outside, Cassie looked at us and grinned. I think it worked. We have to do this again every day for a week or so, but I think it worked. We all looked at each other, unsure if we had all experienced the same thing, and then Bethany spoke up. What was that sound? Was it the baby or was it the pipes? Cassie shrugged. I don't know, but once we finish this, it's really going to work. Let's meet here at the same time tomorrow. With that, she turned and began walking to the cafeteria, and we all slowly followed. The next day, we all met at the outside bathroom again at the same time. This time, when Cassie turned on the faucet, the squealing began immediately. It truly sounded like a baby crying, and I was freaked out immediately. But Cassie shut down my objections and told Bethany to lock the door and to turn off the light. As soon as the lights were off, I squeezed my eyes shut. Cassie recited her poem, and I tried my best to block out the sound of that squealing water faucet. What I couldn't brush off, though, was the weight that I had felt suddenly placed in my cradled arms. When Cassie said, "Now," I was the first to the door. I tried to ask the other girls about it later, but none of them would honestly answer whether or not the pipe sounded like a crying baby, or if any of them had felt the weight in their arms. We repeated this for the next few days, but I no longer cradled my arms. I may have imagined it, but I didn't want to feel that weight again. After Friday's ritual, Cassie grinned at us all and said, Monday should be the final one. We'll finally see Mary. We all talked over the phone during the weekend, but Erica was the only one who felt anything similar to the apprehension that I did. She didn't tell the others though, only me. So, when Monday came around, I guessed that I wasn't the only one feeling the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. The clock ticked by, and the anxiety grew worse, until it was finally time. I felt like I was going to vomit. We all met up at the bathroom and followed Cassie in. Her confidence seemed to spread throughout us, and while it did help a bit, I felt like the other girls had gotten the majority of it. I still ended up in front of that mirror, terrified. Cassie turned the sink on, and I didn't even wait for Bethany to turn the lights off before I closed my eyes. The sound of the baby crying began almost at the same time that Cassie began to recite the poem. Baby blue, baby blue, your mommy's gone away. Baby blue, please come here to stay. Baby blue, we'll care for you. We're sorry your mommy could not. Baby blue, please come to us. We promise that you won't rot. Baby blue, your mommy's gone, but we will heal your pain. Baby blue, please come to us. Your mommy is insane. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room in an instant, and I fought to breathe through the hot thickness. I heard someone whimper softly. Erica, maybe, but I refused to open my eyes, so I couldn't be sure. I stood completely motionless, Cassie and Nia on my left, Bethany and Erica on my right. The events that followed are something that I only allow myself to think of in my darkest moments, but will always be imprinted in my mind. Drop the baby, Cassie yelled at the same time that someone on my right began to scream. Shortly afterwards, someone else, I think Nia, began to scream as well. Drop the baby, now, Cassie yelled out again, and through the screams I heard a new sound. It sounded like ripping up an old t-shirt, but as if the fabric was wet. No, someone yelled, and then there was a new sound, a bubbling, gurgling, wet noise. I wrapped my arms around myself and took a step back away from the other girls. The ripping sound was coming faster, and the cry of the baby was becoming more shrill. Mary? I heard Cassie mutter, followed by another scream. My eyes! Someone on my right yelled out, and I couldn't take it anymore. I raced towards the bathroom door, blindly running my hands against it to find the deadbolt. There was a horrible wet snarling sound behind me, and I had just touched my fingers against the cold metal of the lock when I felt something grab me by my shoulder, sending a searing pain down my arm before I felt my body being thrown backwards. I must have hit my head, because I passed out soon afterwards. I woke up in the hospital with my parents by my side. We were soon joined by police officers who wanted to talk to me about what happened. She's been unconscious for 5 days, and she's obviously been traumatized. Can't this wait? Sir, I understand that this is troubling, but how would you feel if you were the father of one of the other girls? Please, sir, she may be able to provide crucial answers to all of this. My father stepped aside with a sigh and let one of the officers approach my hospital bed. Hi, Nikki, he said with a soft smile. I need to ask you some questions about what went on in the bathroom, about what happened with you and your friends. Do you think you can do that favor for me? I nodded slightly before asking, did something happen to my friends? Are they okay? The officer's eyes briefly darted away from me and I continued. You aren't going to believe me when I tell you, and I didn't see anything anyways, because my eyes were kept shut the entire time. I truly didn't see anything. I promise. I only heard things. The warm smile continued and he said, It's okay, Nikki. Just tell me everything you heard then. I told him the entire story, about Mary and our ritual, and as I went on, my parents' faces became more horrified. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. But mostly I was scared of what may have happened to Cassie and the others. When I had finished describing everything, I asked the officer about my friends. He apologized and said that he wasn't allowed to discuss it with me. The cops left the room, so I asked my parents the same question, and it caused my mom to break out in tears. I ended up not finding anything out until a few weeks later. when I was checked into an inpatient mental health facility for a mandatory stay for at least 90 days. I had no idea what was going on, but I saw a therapist daily to discuss what went on in the bathroom. After the first few days of me repeating the details over and over during our long session, the therapist finally began to discuss what happened with me. Some of my friends had been hurt that day. One of them had died. My therapist wanted me to name which friend had done this to the rest of us, citing my horribly bruised shoulder as proof that someone physically in the bathroom had done this. She wouldn't accept my explanation of Mary. I'm not sure why she thought it was Cassie. Little by little, my therapist slipped the details. I'm sorry, Nikki, but I just can't accept that something supernatural attacked you and your friends. How then could you explain Bethany being blinded but not the others? How could Erica's cheek be mutilated at nearly the same time? Do you believe that a supernatural being attacked all of you at the same time, but with different attacks? All within just a few minutes? How could that be possible? I had no answer. During another session, how then could Bethany be murdered directly beside all of you, if the same entity was attacking both Erica and Bethany? Are you sure that you didn't see anything at all? And another. Nikki, Nia was standing on the farthest left side, right next to Cassie. Her body was cut open in ribbons. You had your eyes closed the entire time. As you've said many times, you only recall Cassie saying things related to Bloody Mary and the ritual, as you call it. Would it be possible that Cassie could have moved without you knowing? Say to your right where Bethany was? Is it possible that Cassie had something sharp, like a pair of scissors? Something to cut both Nia and Bethany? The therapist refused to acknowledge anything that I said. She insisted that I must have been confused, hearing Cassie's voice on the left and Bethany's voice on the right at the same time. She said I must have been mistaken when I heard the growling, the snarling, the terrified voices of my friends as I fumbled to find the lock on the bathroom door. That I must have seen something and couldn't possibly have kept my eyes shut the entire time. The therapist was an idiot. I continued to tell the truth, and after 90 days I was allowed to go home. I had missed Nia's funeral, and I soon found out that Bethany and Erica were leaving the state, while Cassie had been charged and confined to a psychiatric hospital for Nia's death. My parents chose to homeschool me. It's been 10 years and I try not to think about any of this. In fact, I was able to forget about it for a few years. I was able to live my life normally, albeit avoiding mirrors as much as possible. Just living my life and getting by. Until Cassie called me a few days ago. I don't even know how she found my number, but she left a few voicemails now and hasn't stopped calling. I listened to one voicemail, heard what she wanted, and now I'm trying to convince myself that I want nothing to do with any of it. She has a plan set, and I don't want to be involved. I don't. However, I have to admit that I have been slightly fantasizing about us all going back and doing the ritual, this time with video evidence. I've always wanted to call Bethany and Erica to ask them what they saw, but I never had the courage. Some part of me truly wants to know what actually happened that day. Some part of me wants to try again and keep my eyes open this time, but I truly don't think I'd go through that again. Maybe. For months, I caught glimpses of Clara from the safety of my cubicle. So beautiful, faultless. Through innocent eavesdropping and pattern recall, I unknowingly learned almost every detail of her life. When she had lunch, who her friends were, and where she would be at any given moment of the workday. I even knew where she lived, as we both took the same bus to work. On the long commutes, she never so much as batted an eye in my direction, unfazed by my existence. Admiring from afar was all I ever did, but on this day, I felt an inexplicable urge to connect with her. After settling in at my workstation, I became aware of a grouping of words that made up an ominous internal dialogue.
This is the day. She will be yours.
My blood ran cold. The choice of words and the cadence with which they were spoken. This voice was not my own. "Hello?" I asked quietly, unsure if what I had heard was even really there. A reply confirmed its presence.
You need her.
I stood upright, officially rattled. "Who's there?" By this point, everyone was staring at me, including her. I smiled awkwardly. She made a perturbed look and walked away, seemingly frightened. A wonderful first exchange. Everyone else averted their eyes and returned to work. I sat down and attempted to do the same, chalking up my bizarre experience to a lack of sleep. I sugarcoated the denial further with an internet search that backed up this theory and confirmed that audible hallucinations were a side effect of the new allergy medicine I was taking. Satisfied with my haphazard research, I craned my neck around the confines of my cubicle and noticed that Clara was shuffling some papers around at the copy machine. A strange feeling overcame me in this moment. For whatever reason, I felt I could bear the distance between us no longer. My legs began moving, opposite the signals my brain tried sending them to stop. I couldn't believe what I was doing, but infatuation seemed to outweigh my fear. I felt such a strong need to just reach out and touch her. Just as I was about to take my final step in her direction, our boss came over and pulled her aside to discuss some work-related matters. I sighed in relief, shaken by my own actions. Another internet search turned up evidence that sleep deprivation coupled with certain antihistamines can translate into a hormone imbalance, potentially leading to an increased libido. That must have been it, I thought. Despite its many holes, this explanation sat well with me, at least for a few moments.
Chase her down. Demand her attention.
The voice was back. Panic set in as I dove into my work and did my absolute best to ignore the taunting, as well as my new urges. This was easier said than done, especially with how often Clara walked by my cubicle to get to and from her various workplace destinations. At one point, I almost grabbed her leg as she strolled past. I was able to pull my arm back with the other. Luckily, she hadn't noticed. I tempered my outburst and went about business as usual. Although we went to work at the same time, Clara left an hour before I did, just in time to catch the last bus. My projects ran a little late, so I would usually have a willing coworker bring me home. On this day, however, it was the middle of winter, and there was a storm coming. Most of the staff had left early to beat the snow. I would have been smart to do the same, but focusing on my work was the only thing that kept my mind off Clara, which in turn kept the disembodied voice at bay. Closing time snuck up on me faster than expected.
Find her.
I stopped at the elevator. "Please, just leave me alone," I begged in a hushed tone. The voice repeated its demand, louder this time.
Find her.
No, I shouted, fed up but still scared. The voice responded in kind.
Then suffer.
All at once, I stopped breathing. I felt my chest begin to cave in as the oxygen within dissipated. I fell to the floor before I could reach the phone at my station and call for help. Just as quickly as it started, the episode ended, and the air once again filled my lungs.
Do not disobey.
This warning was enough to render me terrified. From this point forward, I had no choice but to give in to the voice's commands. Some way, somehow, I would have to go to Clara. I pulled out my phone. As expected, there were no ride-sharing services available. A driving ban had just been issued due to the coming weather. Fantastic. Upon exiting the building without so much as a long-sleeve shirt to keep me warm, I headed off into the direction of Clara's home, backtracking over the route taken by our bus. It would take me roughly 4 hours to get to her by foot. Knowing this, I made long and firm strides in the hope of minimizing the amount of time it would take me to reach her. While walking down Main Street in this fashion, I noticed a lot of businesses closing up for the night due to the approaching blizzard. One of these shops was a local florist.
A gift.
Knowing what the voice had in mind, I pushed the door open just as the florist was about to lock up, startling the hell out of her. I grabbed the nearest rose I could find, threw some money down on the counter, and left in haste. I didn't wish to feel my lungs collapse again. I began power walking towards Clara's house, hoping I would beat the storm there. Before making it too far, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. I looked down and saw droplets of blood splattered across the ground. It was the rose. I had grabbed an uncut one, thorns and all. My palm was now bleeding profusely, but I kept walking. The voice returned to encourage me, but this time it was faint, barely a whisper.
She's waiting for you.
I trudged through the harsh winds, my pace never wavering. The storm was closing in. About the halfway point, I felt snow. It began falling at a swift and steady rate, making it almost impossible to see in front of me. I stood with my back to the current in an attempt to catch my breath, but another whispered incentive kept me going.
Continue.
I pressed on, feeling the sting of the snow on my bare face. After an hour or so, a mark formed on my arm. It was beginning to turn black. This was the onset of frostbite, I guessed. It only grew darker as time went on. The others soon followed suit. I could only assume that the rest of my skin was turning as well. I was concerned, but not enough to falter and face the deadly consequences. After another long and treacherous hour, I finally arrived at her street.
Be with her.
The lawn was covered in snow, but I could still see the stone walkway leading the way to the front door. I took a step onto it, but quickly fell to the ground, slipping on a sheet of ice. My arm met the unforgiving ground below. It was more than likely broken, but I couldn't feel a thing. I stood up and kept walking. Having more than likely heard the sound of my fall, Clara opened the front door and walked out to meet me. She simply looked at my frostbitten and disfigured form with a horrified expression. She raised her hand over her mouth in shock. I reached up and presented her the rose. I had little energy left to speak, but I managed to offer her a couple of words. For you. She stared at me, just as she had earlier. Those eyes of disgust, that look of confusion. It was now turning into sheer terror. Before I could offer an explanation, she began to scream. She screamed so loudly that a splitting pain consumed my ears. My feelings for her would not be reciprocated. Without warning, A swirling vortex of red energy burst from my skin and hung above us. We both cowered in its presence. Before we could escape, the entity rushed to Clara and wrapped itself around her arms and legs, pinning her in place. An all too familiar sound rang through the stormy night, and I understood what was happening. The voice was no longer in my head, and it was not happy with Clara.
Kill her.
Just as it had earlier in the day, my body moved without me. My arm was raised, and I noticed a red glow emanating from the rose, similar in color to the entity. I was compelled to strike Clara, to slash her open with its thorns. I did my best to resist, but my possessed legs quickly closed the gap between us. As my arm wound up for the attack, I cried out, "No!" I yelled, to which the entity responded,
Do as you are told.
I can't quite explain it, but in this bleak moment, an idea sprung to mind. Less a thought than it was a feeling. A last-ditch effort to fight back. Okay, I'll do it. Just please release me.
Very well. Make it quick.
My restraints were lifted. I was surprised it had complied, but did my best to not show it. I then looked at Clara, with saddened eyes. I'm sorry. I swung the rose and struck skin. Blood poured onto the snowy ground. My blood.
What are you doing?
I sliced open every inch of my skin I could see. In a low whisper, the voice pleaded with me.
No. Stop this at once. I beg you.
Clara was freed from her bindings and ran back into the house. I kept cutting until there was a pool of red surrounding me. I fell into it and slowly lost consciousness. When I awoke, I was in a hospital bed. To my left was Clara, asleep in a chair. I was in a great deal of pain, but it seemed my wounds had been attended to. Better yet, I no longer felt the darkness within. I guess my plan worked. I tried to get up, knocking over my IV in the process. The noise woke Clara. You're awake. Please, lie back down. You need your rest. Her eyes were just as beautiful as I remembered. Are you okay? I asked. I'm fine. Just a little frazzled and confused is all. She picked up the IV and handed me a glass of water. What was that thing? How did you know to stop it? I had to dwell on it for a second to recollect all the details. I don't know. It was a strange sensation I became aware of. I felt as though it was tied to my veins in some way, a blood demon of sorts. Without my blood, it couldn't survive. She stared at me, silent. You probably think I'm crazy, don't you? She shot me an infectious smile. I was there too. I heard it, saw it even. If you're crazy, we both are. We laughed. A far better exchange than my first. If I was keeping score. The rest of the day was nice. We talked for hours and really got to know each other. Before she left, Clara promised she would visit the following day. For a brief window, things were looking really good. But then, a familiar voice broke through, shattering the illusion.
I told you she would be yours.
I work as an ice road trucker. Every winter, I drive my semi up the Dalton Highway in Alaska to deliver supplies. Other drivers complain about how isolated the road is, but I love it. Driving through the expanses of snow-covered wilderness, surrounded by nothing but the stars. It's the dream. Well, it was the dream. Until the night of January 17th, 2017. I was driving the stretch between Coldfoot and the Purdue Bay oil field around midnight. It's the loneliest part of the highway. 200 plus miles with no gas stations, restaurants, no cell phone reception, no traces of civilization at all. Then my headlights rolled over a truck. It had skidded off the road and flipped on its side. From the distance, I couldn't tell if it was fresh or a week-old wreck the recovery crews just hadn't picked up yet. "Hey, Jim," I yelled. He was back in the sleeper. We drove together and took turns, so we didn't have to stop for the night. Besides, it was always safer to have a second person if we ran into an emergency. He poked his blonde head out. "What's up?" "Look." The wreck rapidly approached. It was dark. No headlights, no fire, no lights on in the cabin. Just a metal husk, breaking the otherwise monotonous Alaskan landscape. "Poor fella," he said, reaching for the cup in the holster. A long slurp echoed from behind me. "This road gets mighty nasty sometimes. Maybe we should stop, see if they might need help." "Nah, it's an old wreck. Look how dark it is." Uneasiness settled in my stomach. I'd always felt safe driving up the Dalton Highway because fellow truckers were so helpful. Once, when I had gotten a flat, no less than 3 stopped in to make sure I was all right. It was like we were all part of an unspoken brotherhood, looking out for one another. I stomped on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt. Hey, what are you doing?" Jim protested. "We're stopping?" "I'm sorry, I just need to make sure no one's in there." Leaving the headlights on, I swung the door open and pulled myself down. Wait, I'm coming," Jim called after me, putting on a coat. I didn't wait for him. Instead, I walked ahead, ice crunching noisily under my boots. The cold wind bit into my exposed face, and I grimaced. "Hello?" I called out into the darkness. No answer. "Anyone there?" I called again. "See, there's no one there," Jim said, coming up from behind me. "See, we stopped for nothing." I ignored him and walked towards the cabin. It was facing away from us, pointed towards the forest in the distance. The trailer was nondescript, no logo or color, but the back hatch was open, rolled up just a few inches. Jim called out behind me. "See, they moved all the supplies already. They even left the hatch open. This thing's probably been here for weeks." "Okay, I get it," I called back, annoyed. "I just want to check out the cabin, alright? Humor me." "Humor you? Huh, we're wasting precious time, Danny." I ignored him and walked across the frozen plain, my boots crunching loudly through the snow. I rounded the corner and came upon the cabin. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a mangled mess of metal. The hood was crunched like a tin can. The side mirror dangled limply. There was no windshield, just a misshapen hole where it used to be. Through it, I could make out the driver's seat. It was horribly buckled and bent, conjuring awful images of what the driver must have looked like. "Hello?" I called through the window. It looked empty, but just in case, all was silent. "It's empty, huh?" Jim asked, a wild smile on his face. "Yeah, and I don't think the driver made it." I replied, my mouth suddenly dry. The highway. She takes him good sometimes. Nothing we can do. Just the circle of life and all that. Great. Jim was being poetic now. Okay, Jim, I said, cutting him off. Let's get back to the road. That's when I noticed it. The snow around the truck was undisturbed. No swirl or frantic footprints from the rescue team. No tire tracks from the police cars racing to the scene. No grooves from the body being dragged away. The cabin was empty. The driver had most likely perished, and no rescue team had come out. Why weren't there any prints around here? I asked Jim. If the rescue team came out. Must be weeks old, like I said. Probably snowed 10 times since they got him and the supplies out. Covered the prints right up. Yeah, I guess you're right. That did make sense. Now that I took a closer look, there weren't any skid marks in the snow from the truck either. Defeated, I turned and walked back towards our truck. Wait, what's this? I turned around. Jim was crouched in the snow, trailing a finger across the ground. What's what? These prints. I walked back over and crouched beside him. There were several overlapping trails of footprints. They began at the back door of the trailer, weaved through the snow, and ended somewhere in the darkness of the plains. And they looked fresh. The edges were sharp and clean, not softened by the wind or the snowfall. That doesn't make any sense. We're in the middle of nowhere, not a single soul for miles around. Then who made these prints? I don't know. Well, let's find out. Jim walked over to the back door and with a grunt, pulled it open. The metallic sound reverberated through the trailer, echoing against the snow. I pulled a flashlight from my pocket and flicked it on. What the hell? The trailer looked lived in. Empty glass bottles glinted in the light, stacked up in a line against the wall. Clothing was strewn everywhere. In the right corner, they were piled up with a blanket to form a rough bed. There's nobody. Nobody for at least 200 miles, he said with fascination, pulling himself up into the trailer. What the heck is going on here? Hey, wait, I called after him. We shouldn't. There's tools back here, Danny, he called out, his voice echoing in the metal box. All kinds of knives and spears and stuff. I suppose that's how he gets his food, hunts it down. I stepped onto the lip of the trailer and hoisted myself inside. The air was musty, damp, and cold, though warmer than outside. The floor, which was really the side of the trailer, was tilted at a slight angle. I glanced around. While there were many household items I recognized, knives, shears, clothes, there were some I didn't. A black medallion, emblazoned with a strange symbol next to the bed area. A stone bowl and stick that resembled a mortar and pestle. Danny, take a look at this. I turned the flashlight towards him and jumped back. White bone, twisted mouths, sunken eye sockets, more than a dozen animal skulls, all lined up in a neat row at the back wall. The first was tiny, the size of a mouse head. They grew progressively larger. The last ones looked like they belonged to deer, caribou, and moose. And painted on the ground, under our feet, was some sort of symbol. A circle with strange characters all around it, like letters from an unknown language. This is freaking creepy, Jim said. I wish I brought my camera. Despite my thick jacket, a chill went up my spine. Come on, Jim, let's go. Like you said, we're wasting time. We'll get to Purdue late, and... Oh, now you care about wasting time. His blue eyes met mine. You're just a scaredy cat. That's what you... We both froze. That sound had been faint, but in the absolute silence of the Alaskan wasteland, it was more than just a random sound. More than the wind, the forest, the earth could produce. You hear that? Jim whispered. We listened, but there was only silence. Okay, let's get out of here, Jim said, taking a step forward. We walked to the front of the trailer, our footsteps shaking the metal. Then we jumped out into the snow. My blood ran cold. A man stood in the darkness, dressed head to toe in black tattered clothing. A hood veiled his face in shadow, and a knife glinted in his right hand, catching the light of our headlights. We broke into a run. He bolted forward, crunching footsteps rang behind us, growing louder by the second. My lungs burned in the cold air, but I forced myself forward. My hand fell on the metal handle of the truck. I dove in. Jim followed me a second later. He madly pressed the lock button. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled underneath us. Drive, Jim yelled, panting. My headlights flashed over the man. He stood still in the snow, staring at us with wild blue eyes, gripping the knife tightly. And behind him, more figures materialized around the fallen trailer, all wearing black hooded clothing. They remained still, their heads turning to stare as we pulled onto the highway. Then they were left in the dust as we sped forward into the Alaskan wilderness. We called the police, but by the time they made it out there, the truck had been cleaned up. It was just an empty old wreck. No animal skulls, no strange symbols, no sign that anyone ever lived there. I hadn't driven a truck up the Dalton Highway since that night. I still deliver supplies, but to other parts of Alaska. Never again will I voluntarily drive up that cursed road. But sometimes, I hear about disappearances along that highway. A lonely trucker here or there, vanishing into thin air. His vehicle left behind, parked on the side of the road. And I know he didn't just get lost on that lonely stretch of highway. He was taken. I live in a small but lively town in Massachusetts. Its local legends have fueled my love affair with the paranormal. It's a subject that fascinates me to this day, coupled with insomnia. This passion led me to spend many a night at the nearby cemetery, hoping to see a ghostly apparition while walking through to pass the time. These outings were unfruitful, void of all activity, supernatural or otherwise. My dream of stealing a glimpse at what comes after eventually subsided, but I continued to visit the graves. It was a place where I could collect my thoughts when sleep eluded me. One night, however, something changed. It was a dark spring evening. I was bored, couldn't sleep, and felt the need to do something outdoors, in the cool night air. As it so often did, the local graveyard called out to me. I obliged, unable to resist the allure of its calming nature. Sometimes, I was even tempted to set up camp there and sleep amongst the dead. Knowing this would be frowned upon and perhaps morbid, I settled for my walks. They were enough to make me at least somewhat weary by night's end. After a couple of hours there, I decided on one last stroll along the headstones in an attempt to become tired before heading home. Upon starting my walk, I noticed something. There was a light on in the groundskeeper's shack. It wasn't like him to be working so late. This was completely out of the ordinary, until you factored in the large gaping hole nearby, big enough for several caskets. It was a miracle I hadn't fallen into it earlier in the night. Curious as to what the old man was up to, I crept over to the shack, making my way to the busted window on its side. What I saw was strange. Inside were 9 men wearing tattered blue shrouds, partaking in a makeshift feast. The main course was an oily, red stew with a horrific smell that permeated up the shack's walls and ventured up my nasal passage, tempting me to gag. The men winced when putting it to their lips, save for 3. A tall man at the end of the table, and the 2 sat beside him. When the feast was over, this tall figure stood up and addressed the room. "Hello, newcomers. I hope dinner has been to your liking." He spoke with a firm voice. It resonated throughout the shack and beckoned even me to listen. "Now that our bellies are full, Elijah, will you explain the rules of your impending trial?" I listened closely. It seemed the men in the shack were part of a collective known as the Bloodlights. The trial the tall man spoke of was something akin to a medieval gladiator sport used to initiate new members. I listened on as Elijah divulged the game's inner workings, fearful but curious. 2 teams were to disperse to opposite sides of the cemetery, each consisting of 4 members, 3 blood runners, and 1 blood baron. The initiates would be the runners, and the tall man's henchmen would act as the barons. There was one more participant to be discussed: the tall man himself. He was the blood keeper. Though not on either team, he was the most crucial facet of the game. He kept and guarded what was referred to as the blood. I gathered that this referred to the red amulet hanging from the keeper's neck, as he firmly clasped it every time the word blood was uttered. The job of the runners was to retrieve the blood from the keeper. The barons acted as counsel, overseeing each team and helping where needed. After Elijah finished his lecture, the blood keeper took over. "With every wound, there is blood. With every drop of blood, there is solace. Without death, there can be no light." The keeper opened a large cupboard in the corner of the shack, revealing a woman, bound and gagged, futilely attempting to cry out for help. My heart sank. This was not your normal run-of-the-mill cult ritual. I had to find help, but what if they heard me? Unable to nail down my next course of action, I was immobile, frozen in fear. The blood keeper continued. "The light of blood can only be seen in death." Pulling a large red dagger out from his cloak, he grabbed the woman and plunged it into her gut. I watched in horror as the life left her eyes. She began to shriek, but was soon cut off by a cut to the chest, followed by a final blow to her neck. I was mortified. After throwing his kill to the floor, the keeper pulled out 3 vials, filling each of them with blood that dripped from his blade. This was the blood the runners were after, not the amulet. "This is all the blood I have to offer. That gives, at most, 3 of you the opportunity to become bloodlights. And remember, you are being watched. Those who fail to collect must be disposed of. The same goes for any outsiders you encounter. Corpses are to be thrown in the pit." Dear God, I was truly in danger. That's what the nearby hole was for, the perfect hiding spot for a mass grave. You must stop at nothing to obtain one of these vials. All others will be sacrificed. Your thirst for blood must be as strong as your will to live." The men exited the shack to begin the trial. I scurried silently to the wooded part of the graveyard and hid behind a large tree. Not wanting to end up like that poor woman, I just needed an opening to escape without being noticed. Glancing out at the cemetery, I saw a runner knelt before a grave, eyes closed. I assumed this was a requirement before the game commenced. A perfect chance for me to make a run for it. "Let the trial begin." The Bloodkeeper's voice echoed through the trees. Before I could even take a single step towards safety, my survival still hung in the balance. Using a moonlit pool of water by my feet as a reflective surface, I watched as Elijah and 3 runners strategized, just 10 yards from my position. My heart was pounding so hard, I worried they could hear it. Between the beating in my chest and the conspiring whispers that filled the forest, my ears were consumed with an unsettling symphony of torture. Just when I couldn't bear another moment, silence cut through the brisk night air, like the Keeper's dagger piercing that woman's skin. A chill then buried into my spine. The puddle's reflection bore no cloaked figures. Peering out from behind the tree confirmed that they were gone, or at least nowhere to be seen. This was my chance. Looking off in the distance, I saw a tomb by the main road, maybe 100 yards away. It would provide the perfect cover to escape towards civilization, but there was no way I could waltz over there without being seen. The woods wrapped around the cemetery, so running from tree to tree would strengthen my odds of survival. I took a deep breath and braced myself. Without so much as a second thought, I dashed to the next tree on the path to safety and took cover. I then gathered my wits and surveyed my surroundings. No cloaks in sight. I sprinted to the next tree and took another glimpse out at the world. The coast was still clear. As I was about to take off in the direction of my next hiding spot, panic set in as my feet inexplicably left the solid ground. My blood ran cold as I was lifted into the air by some unseen force. The next thing I knew, my body was hoisted up and placed atop a tree branch. There, I was greeted by the unnerving sight of my captor, a blood runner. I didn't scream or tried to get away. It would be no use. I sat there in terror and exhaled what I thought would be my last breath. But instead of gutting me, the man spoke. "What's your name?" I was too shocked to respond. "Come on now, who are you?" He spoke clearer this time, revealing a slight English accent. "Look, I noticed you at the window over there, eavesdropping. If I wanted you dead, I could have killed you then. I want you to help me." "Help you?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to use you to my advantage. I take it you know what we're doing here, and you know the rules of the game." I nodded slowly, still shook. "Good. With you, I may be able to turn the tables and get the upper hand." I was frightened, but I calmed down enough to focus on the runner's plan. "See that tomb over there? That's where the Bloodkeeper is." My stomach turned. To think, this guy may have just saved my life. "I need you to go over to the tomb and open the door. Slowly. The Bloodkeeper will surely take a swing at you. Just as he's about to end your life, I'll swoop in and end his." "But why?" I asked. "That's not part of the game." "Right you are. You need not concern yourself with the why. Just know that if you don't do as I say, I'll kill you myself. Now get going." The man gave me his cloak for protection and pushed me out of the tree. I didn't want to risk facing the Bloodkeeper, but I didn't want to perish at the runner's hands either. My fear of dying kept me from deviating. I again ran from tree to tree, eventually making it to my destination, the stench of bloodshed wafting through the air as the runners fought for control of the field. With my back pressed to the cold aged stone, the pull to escape grew. The main road was within reach, but the thought quickly subsided. I was far too worried the Englishman would catch up with me and take his price. He was able to climb a tree and lift my weight into it without a sound. It was clear he possessed the agility and stealth needed to take me by surprise during a haphazard run for the hills. I sighed in defeat, knowing that, one way or another, I would probably die that night. Mustering up every bit of courage I had left, I crept around the tomb and faced its door. My shaking hands reached for the rusted handle and pulled it towards me. Before its hinges could even creak at the motion, the door burst open, pushed from within. The force knocked me over, my head connecting with the unforgiving ground. The moments that came after remained fuzzy. The Bloodkeeper towered over me, half his body in shadow, the other soaked in moonlight. A vision of death there to still the blood from my racing heart. My eyes grew weary and shut for an instant before opening to see another figure. I couldn't make out who was who in my dazed state, but one attacked the other, completely overpowering them. The prey in this scuffle fell to his knees, before landing face first into the cold cemetery soil. The familiar sound of metal colliding with flesh rang through the air, as the victor saw to it that the job was done. I prayed it was the Bloodkeeper being torn apart. Otherwise, I was a goner. My eyes shut again, before unconsciousness finally took hold. "Hey, are you all right?" I heard an old man's voice as I came to. "Are you okay?" I opened my eyes to see who it was. The groundskeeper stood over me, holding a lantern to my face. "What? How? Where are they?" "Where's who?" he asked. "You don't understand. I should be dead." The groundskeeper stared at me, confused, but then smiled. "Come on, kid. You'll catch a cold out here." The groundskeeper, who I now know to be Pete, invited me into his shack. He prepared some food and tossed me a blanket to keep warm. Thankful, and in need of an ear to fill, I told him everything, despite how I knew it would sound. I didn't describe the men by their given titles, but Pete seemed to know who I was talking about. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Bloodkeeper." "That's him. How did you know?" "His spirit has been visiting these grounds for over 100 years now, I suppose." His spirit? Incredible. It was all a haunting. Something I thought I wanted to experience firsthand. Pete and I talked for a long while. He knew all about the Bloodlights and their dastardly deeds. Apparently, they were a sadistic cult that formed in the 1800s, terrorizing the local community. Each Bloodlight initiation brought with it more disappearances. They used the cemetery as a space for their trials, burying casualties and sacrifices at the end of every night. After all, who would look for bodies in a graveyard? Over 50 souls fell victim to the Bloodlights before their sinister games were brought to an end. During their last outing, an Englishman infiltrated their ranks and killed the Bloodkeeper, avenging the death of his wife, who had been murdered during one of their trials. Soon after, his disciples came forward, claiming to have control by the Bloodkeeper's amulet, alleging that it had supernatural powers. No such amulet was ever recovered. After Pete explained everything, I sat in awe, dumbstruck by the whole ordeal. Had I relived that fateful night? Or did I time travel and help that man fulfill his goal? I may never know what happened that day, but one thing is certain. I will never visit another cemetery for as long as I live, just in case the ghost of the Bloodkeeper is still out there, making his rounds. I awoke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the bedside table. "Hello?" I said groggily.
You're that paranormal hunter, right?
I had the website changed, new business cards made up, and even sunk some money into an ad campaign. Still, all callers insisted on referring to me as the paranormal hunter, a term originally coined by tabloid papers, who made me out to be some sort of monster-fighting hero. It wouldn't be so bad if it didn't negatively affect my livelihood. Those articles made me a laughingstock to skeptics everywhere, including the local authorities I sought to work with on occasion. Actually, it's paranormal consultant.
Right, sorry. I need your help.
She sounded just like the rest, scared, confused, and at the end of her rope. I was the last call anyone made in situations like this. A desperate cry for help when all else failed. It's as if dialing the number was some admittance of insanity. Or worse, a confirmation that the things that go bump in the night are really out there, waiting in the shadows to pounce on their next victims. "I'm here to help. What can I do for you?" She let out a long sigh before continuing.
Well, you're not going to believe this.
That's what they all said.
I received this odd list of rules in the mail. I didn't pay it any mind at first, thinking it was a mix-up at the post office, but now, every time I unknowingly break a rule...
Let me guess. There's some sort of strange, paranormal consequence?
Yes, exactly. How did you know?
Lists like these have been popping up all over the country. Some in hotel rooms, others in apartments or employee manuals. They were all the same. Supernatural calamity befalls any victim who refuses to follow the guidelines. When enough rules are broken, it usually results in the person's death. Not to worry, I've dealt with this kind of thing before. I'll take your case. Just text me your address and I'll be right over.
Thank you so much. I wasn't sure you would believe me.
In my line of work, it pays to have an open mind. After disconnecting and throwing on some clothes, I got into my car and took off in the direction of her house. It was in town, so the drive was a short one. Upon arriving, my new client rushed out to greet me. Her arms were crossed and breathing labored. She was clearly out of sorts.
Sorry, where are my manners? I'm Jessica.
Nice to make your acquaintance. I'm Henry. Jessica was young, maybe mid to late 20s, dark hair, freckled skin. I probably would have found her attractive if she didn't remind me of my daughter.
Please, come inside.
We walked to the front door and entered the house. After hanging up my hat, I took a look around. It was a lovely home, quaint but spacious.
Can I get you some coffee?
No thank you. If it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to get to work right away. Do you have the list? She picked up a sheet of paper from the coffee table and handed it to me. There were 10 rules in total. How many have you broken so far? She looked embarrassed.
7 altogether.
That's good, Jessica. It means there's still time.
Still time for what?
Time to end things. I pulled the lighter out of my pocket and held the flame beneath the page.
What are you doing?
Not many people know this, but burning a list before all the rules are broken summons the demon who wrote it. She glared at me, petrified, a look of absolute fear across her face.
Demon?
The flame spread to the outer edges of the paper. Yes, these lists are powerful demonic contracts. With every rule you break, you're tempting fate, inviting the demon to absorb your soul.
My soul?
The page had all but burned up now. Yes, they feed off them. With a list like this, the demon has access to your soul. Every misstep is another chance to feed. After all the rules are broken, your soul is theirs completely, as per the unwritten terms of the contract. The sheet of paper turned to ash and fell to the floor. Jessica started to ask another question, but I held my hand up to stop her. Wait, it's coming. We watched as a cloud of smoke formed at the center of the living room. It grew until it reached the ceiling and swirled around, faster with each passing second. After a minute or so, it dissipated, revealing the demon within. Hello, Henry. It took the form of a man in turn-of-the-century attire. Gray hair, gray mustache. Jessica walked over and stood by his side. I see you've met my daughter. I would be lying if I said I wasn't surprised at this revelation. But all the signs of foul play were there that I should have picked up on. No car in the driveway, no family photos on the wall, and no signs of a struggle in the house. Despite Jessica having broken most of the rules. What is this? The demon laughed. You've made quite the impression downstairs with your heroic shenanigans over the years. I've been tasked with eliminating you. I reached into my coat for a weapon, but the demon gestured for me to stop. Please, Henry, I have another deal in mind. Why don't we make a deal? I scoffed. A deal, huh? And what exactly did you have in mind? He smiled. Give me your soul, and I'll bring back your daughter. My heart sank. Chelsea was the whole reason I hunted supernatural things in the first place. She had died over a decade ago in a house fire, one that I discovered, after years of investigation, was caused by some unknown entity. I was never the same after that. Instead of grieving in the way most parents do, I made it my life's work to track down her killer, and everything like it. What do you say, Henry? It's a fair trade. I would give anything to save Chelsea, even my soul, but not like this. Demonic resurrections always came with side effects. It was very likely that, if Chelsea was brought back, she would succumb to an insatiable bloodthirst. Not unlike that of demons themselves. I could never put her through something so terrible. Not a chance. His lips contorted into a wicked grin. I thought you might say that. That's why I had my daughter slip something into your pocket. Confused, I reached into my coat and pulled out a scrap of paper. There were 3 rules written on it. Rule number 1, don't enter the house. Rule number 2, don't burn the list. Rule number 3, accept the demon's deal. That son of a bitch. Without knowing it, I had broken all the rules on the list, giving this demon full access to my soul. All he had to do now was come and take it. Sorry, Henry. You're mine now. Their skin melted away, dripping from their flames like candle wax, revealing the red connective tissue underneath. Then, their eyes turned black and mouths open wide. No teeth or tongues within, just empty pits of darkness. One kiss would suck the life right out of me. Before I could reach into my coat again, Jessica leapt across the room and pinned me to the wall, forcing her mouth against my face. My soul began to untether itself from me. The sensation was a strange one. There was an immense feeling of pain, but also heartache, the likes of which I have only felt once before. As soul and body separated, Something bubbled to the surface. It wasn't so much my life flashing before my eyes, as it was a single memory playing out in my mind.
I'll be fine, Dad. Stop worrying.
I know. It's just that... Chelsea interjected.
I'm your little girl and it's your job to worry about me?
Am I that predictable? She smiled.
Only when it comes to caring about me.
I looked around at the house and it saddened me. I was happy for Chelsea, but I couldn't believe how quickly she had grown up. You know you could come visit sometime, right? It's only a 2-hour flight. I can pay for the ticket. Just say the word whenever you feel you want to.
Dad, I'm still your daughter. I'll visit when I can, but you have to come to terms with the fact that I'm an adult with a life of my own. Between work and college, I can't always come when you call, okay?
I laughed as a tear rolled down my cheek. So you're the parent now, is that it? She laughed.
If you don't leave soon, you're gonna miss your flight.
She was right. I admit, I was cutting it pretty close. I know, I'm gonna miss you, that's all.
I'll miss you too, Dad. I'm only a phone call away.
With that, I left the house and drove to the airport. Little did I know then, but that would be the last time I ever saw my little girl alive. I hadn't thought of that day in quite some time. It was locked away, deep in my heart, for fear of the feelings it would evoke in me. In this dire moment, my life was hanging in the balance. It served as a reminder of why I did the things no one else would dare do, why I fought to save others and kill the things that left evil in their wake. It was all for her. With what strength I had left, I reached into my coat, pulled out a blade, and plunged it into Jessica's side. She backed off and fell onto the floor, writhing in pain. It couldn't kill demons, but it sure as hell slowed them down. Before the man could come to his daughter's aid, I quickly sliced my hand open and used the blood to paint a sigil on the wall. One push at the center, and the demons would vanish, cast back into the underworld where they belonged. It was a temporary fix, but I was in no condition to fend them off. "Henry, wait!" The man called out to me, my hand over the sigil, ready to send him packing. "Don't you want to know what happened to Chelsea?" He was stalling, I could tell, but I had the upper hand and could afford to hold off for a moment. It might have been foolish, but I gave in to my curiosity and listened. She screamed when the flames overtook her. Her skin peeled and flaked while she cried. He was lying. He didn't know what happened. Still, I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Even a fabricated story about my daughter was better than no story at all. As morbid as it sounds, it made me feel closer to her. His words offered a setting in which I could fantasize about saving her, something I often did but struggled to picture. It was an addiction of mine. She was so terrified, she couldn't stop speaking nonsense, counting backwards from 10. I killed her before the fire could, just to shut her up. My blood ran cold. That was something I taught her when she was little.
Daddy, help!
I awoke to Chelsea screaming and ran to her bedroom. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" Her breath was sporadic. Something certainly had her rattled.
It's here! The monster!
It was another one of her night terrors. Ever since her mother died, she would get them at least twice a week. Every time, I would come to the rescue and calm her down. "Okay, sweetie, it's just a bad dream. You're still sleeping." She wouldn't let up. I took her in my arms and held her. "Remember what I taught you? Count backwards from 10 and it'll all fade away." She whimpered for a moment and then began counting.
10, 9, 8, 7.
Her breaths were becoming more even and controlled.
6, 5, 4, 3.
She stopped crying and loosened her grip on my arm.
2, 1.
And just like that, she was awake, free from the nightmares that plagued her. "All right, sweetie. You're okay now. Go back to sleep." She offered me an innocent smile and crawled back under the covers. I left the door open just a crack, enough so that I could hear her and come running if she needed me. Just like I did every time. He had to have been telling the truth. He could have never known about that otherwise. "Well, Henry, I'm the one that killed her all those years ago. She had a list, just like yours, and broke every rule. I showed up to collect." My heart nearly stopped right then and there. All this time chasing monsters, and he was right here, in the same room with me, the thing responsible for taking my little girl's life. "Come on, Henry. Don't you want to avenge your daughter?" My hand hovered over the sigil. Jessica was still on the floor. It took everything in me not to pull away and lash out. That's just what he wanted. He knew I didn't have the energy needed to kill him. Not with my soul tattered. She begged for her life, you know. It was pathetic. I was dangerously close to taking the bait. All I could see was Chelsea's house going up in flames. "You were her father. Why didn't you save her, Henry?" I needed to calm down. Otherwise, I would surely retaliate and be as good as dead. No more hunting. No more lives to save. No killing this demon. Once and for all. Some father you were, leaving your girl out there in the world to die. All alone. I counted backwards in my head. 10, 9, 8. What's the matter, Henry? Too scared to fight back? It was working. The anger and sadness were still there, but his voice was fading from the foreground. 7, 6, 5. I can only imagine what's happening to her soul downstairs. Oh, the humanity. The adrenaline in my veins was slowing. 4, 3, 2. This is the only chance you'll ever have, Henry. It's now or never. 1. Calmer than I was before, I pushed my hand into the sigil with as much force as I could muster. "No!" he cried out, but it was no use. His and Jessica's bodies vanished in a flash of light, leaving behind only an unpleasant, burning odor and faint impressions where they were on the carpet. Thank God that's over. I stumbled out to the car and got into the driver's seat, feeling a little better than I had just moments before. Before driving off, I took one last look at the house, feeling a regret similar to when I left Chelsea years ago. This isn't over. With that, I took off down the road, wounded, but with some newfound clarity. I know what I have to do, and no person or thing is going to stop me. That demon's life will be mine, but with the information he gave me, there's another matter I have to attend to first. I'm going to save Chelsea's soul. First, I need to apologize to you. I am so sorry. I'm coming to you in my time of need. Please help me. Please listen to this until the end. That's it. That's all I ask. I don't know what to do or where to run. Please, just help me. It's all I ask. My name is Chris, and I'm a single father. I don't tell you this like it's some badge of honor, and I'm expecting cookies, milk, and chocolate-covered snowflakes, like most of the others in my social circle would. They want your pats on the back and recognition. I just want some of your time. I see fatherhood as a burden. Necessary, yes, but still a burden. My son's name is Jesse. He's 11. That's 5th grade for the math haters. Jesse started the 5th grade this year like any other kid would. There was a little bit of trepidation and lots of excitement. He was a happy-go-lucky sort of kid, full of life and energy. All that changed after he met Stan on Tuesday. Stan was a late addition to Jesse's class, a transfer student from another district. Jesse's teacher sat Stan next to Jesse. When I picked Jesse up after school on Tuesday, he told me that Stan was his new best friend. He wasn't acting like himself though. He was pale and sweaty. I took his temperature, but he wasn't running a fever. I asked about his day, and all he would tell me was that Stan was his new best friend. Stan's my new best friend, Jesse would say. I know, I can't wait to meet him. I'd say back, Dad, Stan is great. You should meet him. He's my new best friend. The best in the whole world. We must have had this same conversation 1,000 times that night. When I tucked Jesse into bed, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He put his little hand in front of his face and wiggled his index finger, telling me to come closer. I bent over him, and he put his hands on either side of his mouth. You know, the little kid way of telling a secret. Well, I turned my head, and he whispered something into my ear that chilled me. At the time, I didn't know why it chilled me, but it did. He whispered, "You believe me, right, Dad?" I sat back up and looked down at him. "Believe you about what, buddy?" "Stan," he said. "Stan's my new best friend." I nodded and took his temperature once more. Again, he wasn't running a fever. I went to bed, but couldn't really sleep that night. On Wednesday, when I pulled up to the school to drop Jesse off, he got this really weird look on his face and told me that he didn't want to go in. "Are you feeling sick?" I asked. "No," he said. He was chewing on his bottom lip like crazy. This was something else I'd never seen him do before. "No, I need to go to school." He opened the car door and got out. No goodbye. No I love you. Nothing. He trudged up the front steps of the school with his head down. I left off the brake and turned away to drive to work. A little boy was standing right in front of my car. 2 more seconds and I would have run him over. The boy was pale, with a mop of blonde hair that was almost white, and bright blue eyes. He knocked on the hood of my car twice, waved once, and walked up the stairs to the school. When I picked up Jesse after school on Wednesday, he looked a lot better. He was a tiny bit paler than normal, but he seemed happy. He told me all about his day. He told me about dinosaurs and music and math, and then he told me about recess. And then after math period, we had recess. Dad, you'll never guess what I did at recess. "Tell me," I said, smiling to myself as I'm driving, thinking tag, football, keep away, all the things I remembered the boys doing at recess when I was that age. Something benign, something normal. I joined a church. I frowned at this. A church? At recess? Jessie nodded. The Church of Stan. I thought that it must have been some sort of make-believe game that the kids were playing. What's the Church of Stan? I asked. It's Stan's church, Dad. Jessie laughed like I was the silliest person in the world for asking that question. What do you guys do, though? You know, as church members? I asked. Lots of stuff. Today, though, we just listened to Stan talk. He was saying some funny words and I got sleepy and dozed off. A bunch of us did. I pulled into the driveway at home and we got out. Was that it? I asked. Things sounded weird for sure, but the kids didn't seem to be doing anything wrong. Stan gave us flyers too. Jessie pulled out a crinkled up piece of paper and handed it to me. It was a piece of manila paper with 3 words written in black marker. Church of Stan. Again, weird, but nothing wrong. I just thought the boys were playing make-believe. I was wrong. When I picked up Jessie after school yesterday, I could tell that something was very wrong with my little boy. He looked panicked and scared. What's going on, buddy? I asked, reaching out to feel his forehead. No fever. We played the soul game today, he said. Jessie's head was on a swivel. He couldn't sit still. He kept looking all around as we headed home. The soul game? I asked. Jessie just nodded and kept trying to look everywhere at once. Beads of sweat dotted his upper lip. What's the soul game? I asked. Jessie shook his head no and said nothing. Jessie, what's the soul game? I asked. I told him I didn't want to, but he said he wouldn't be my friend anymore if I didn't play. Who wouldn't be your friend? Where were the teachers? Jessie started breathing harder, but still answered. It happened in the church, he said. Then he whispered, Teachers aren't allowed in the church. The Church of Stan? I asked. Jessie nodded, and a tear slipped down his cheek. What's the soul game, Jessie? I'm your father. You need to tell me right now and I'll take care of everything, I said. I can't tell you, Dad. I can't. The rules are bad. They're so bad. What about Stan? I asked. Will Stan tell me the rules? No. Jessie screamed this and scared me half to death. Don't ask him the rules. Please don't, Dad. Please. I pulled into the driveway, scared and confused. Promise me, Dad. Promise me. Promise me, please. Jessie was bawling now, terrified. I took him into my arms and rocked him. I hadn't rocked him like that since he'd been in kindergarten. He fell asleep in my arms and I carried him inside. I took him straight to his room and got him ready for bed. He just needs sleep, I kept telling myself. All he needs is sleep. I put him to bed and ate dinner alone. I checked up on him around 9 when I went to bed. He seemed to be sleeping well, so I decided to go to sleep myself. I woke up to him screaming at the top of his lungs, 18 minutes after midnight last night. I ran to his room, but he wasn't in bed. I turned on the light and Jessie came flying out of the closet, like something was chasing him. He latched onto my leg and kept screaming. I tried to calm him down and ask what was wrong at the same time. He wasn't making any sense. He kept screaming about the soul game. It was impossible. I kept asking what that was, but he wouldn't tell me. I tried to put him back to bed, but he would have none of it. Finally, I just took him to my room and he slept in my bed. Jessie fell right asleep. I was lying on my side watching him, stroking his hair, when his eyes popped open and he stared right into mine. I'll tell you the rules after school tomorrow, he said. Then he closed his eyes. What was going on with my kid? In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling for a long time before rolling over on my side and staring into the bathroom. You know how when you're on the edge of sleep, sometimes your leg will kick and jerk you awake? Or you'll imagine you're falling, or that you've just tripped over something and get jerked awake? That happened to me all last night. Only I kept being ripped from my sleep by seeing something in the doorway to the bathroom. Every time my eyes would start to slip shut, I'd see the dark outline of something large in the doorway and jerk awake. Of course nothing would be there, and I would start falling asleep again. The outline would appear in the doorway once more, but it would be closer to me, like it had taken a baby step. Over and over this happened until morning. This morning on the way to school, Jessie seemed out of it, lethargic. I felt the same way. I was even more exhausted. I thought about asking Jessie about what he said right before he fell asleep, but I couldn't. I was afraid it would send him into hysterics again, so I left it alone. I drove him to school, and he didn't say a word the whole time. He was acting like a robot, lifeless, unemotional. I got a call shortly after dropping him off to come pick him back up. He'd vomited in class. When I picked him up, he was the same. I asked him several questions, but he only gave me grunts in response. The plan at home was to get him to change out of his dirty clothes and then take him to the doctor. He didn't say anything until we pulled into the driveway. "Can Stan come over today?" he asked. He stared out the windshield at the garage door. "You're not feeling well, buddy. And do you really want him to come over?" I asked. I wanted to meet this kid, but it didn't sound like Jessie wanted him over. I, however, wanted to get to the bottom of things. "Yes," Jessie said. "Okay," I said. "Do you have his parents' number?" "He already asked his parents, and they said it was okay. We have to wait until he's out of class, and I'd still like to talk to his parents." "Okay." Jessie got out of the car and we walked into the house. "You have their number?" I asked as I shut the door. "No," he said. I started to ask him how I was supposed to call him if I didn't have their number. But someone knocked on the door. I was still standing right next to it. I opened the door, and standing on the front step was the pale little boy with the blue eyes and the mop-white blonde hair that I'd almost run over on Wednesday. A little girl stood next to him with the same complexion. "Yes?" I asked. "Hi, Driz," the little boy said. "Is Jessie home?" The little boy standing on my front porch shouldn't have known that name. It was my nickname from college, created on a drunken night amongst the guys, shortened from Drizzy. "No," I said. "That's fine," the little girl said. "My name is Devin, and you already know my brother's name." "Stan," I said. The little girl covered her mouth and giggled. Stan smiled and shrugged. "It's really quite simple. Rule 1, don't walk past mirrors in the dark. Rule 2, don't leave any doors open when you go to bed tonight. Ask your son what Rule 3 is, and remember, a creak means you're falling behind. A rustle means you've almost lost. When the lights go down, hopefully you won't see the dark shadow standing in the corner of the room. Hopefully you won't hear it breathing as your eyes shut and you begin to drift off. And if you hear a bang, well, hopefully you never hear a bang." Stan turned and walked away with his sister. I stared after them both and shook my head. I wouldn't play their stupid game. I walked into the house and found Jessie sitting at the kitchen table, crying. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I heard a bang," he whispered. My mouth went dry. "When does the game end?" I asked. "It doesn't." he whispered. "It never ends." My heart started beating faster. "What's the third rule, Jesse?" His face fell and he sucked in a deep breath. "Rule 3. Knowing all 3 rules makes you a player." My stomach dropped. "What happens if you lose?" "When it's dark, you'll hear them coming. They like to let you know when they're getting close." "Who?" "Stan and Devin," Jesse said. "They'll reach out through the mirrors or open doorways and drag you through." "How do you win?" I asked. "You win if you tell more people the rules to the soul game than the person that told you does." Like I said, I am so sorry, but thank you for helping. Really, I'm going to enjoy my newfound freedom, and I hope that you enjoy your night. Give Stan and Devin my best." Unexplained phenomenon is a staple in human culture. Strange goings-on, paranormal in nature, are prominent in our lives, in one form or another. You may not think about them all that often, but there's always a piece in the news or a crazy story from a friend or passerby that makes you recall such strangeness. No matter how many times you forget about the subject, there will always be a moment that drags the notion back to the surface of your memory. For several years, I had forgotten all about the monster living in my mom's pantry. I had forgotten all about it. That is, until now. I was 10 years old when I first became aware of the monster's presence. It was a normal evening at home. My mother and I awaited my father's arrival, and I helped her out with dinner preparations. I look back on these memories fondly. I loved cooking with my mom, and was overjoyed whenever my father came home from work. I had what some would consider a picture-perfect childhood, save from one peculiarity. The thing that resided in the pantry would audibly reveal itself that very night. While cutting up vegetables for my mom's famous beef barley soup, I heard a scratching at the pantry door. Startled, I jumped, nearly cutting off one of my fingers in the process. My mom looked over at the pantry, then to me with a concerned smile. I looked at her for answers, utterly baffled by the noise. "There it goes again, scratching at the pantry door." "What is it, Mom?" I asked. "I'm not sure, sweetie, but it's been here ever since we moved in. Sometimes it scratches at the door, other times it'll knock food off the pantry shelves. Some nights, it doesn't make a sound at all." There was no comfort derived from her explanation. I was still frightened, and my mother noticed this. "It's nothing to be scared of, honey." "Is it something bad?" I asked. "No, of course not." Just then, the scratching recommenced. I jumped a second time. My mother then walked over to the pantry door. "Here, look." She opened it up as the scratching continued. Once the door was completely ajar, the sound ceased. "See, sweetie, there's nothing to be worried about." Despite my mother's comforting words, my 10-year-old heart couldn't help but race with fear. In the coming years, I continued to help her cook, but I never once set foot back in that pantry. Convinced that the thing living in there was a monster, out to get me. This fear was kept alive by the scratching that would interrupt otherwise happy moments. I ignored it the best I could, but sometimes I would have to leave the kitchen. Eventually, the sound stopped altogether. It's now been many years since then, and both of my parents have passed away. In their wills, I was left everything, including my childhood home. It took me a while to come to terms with their deaths and move back in, but I eventually accepted the situation and embraced the living space where I grew up. It was the little memories sprinkled throughout the house that helped me cope. Sometimes I would walk in the living room and see my dad sitting in his chair, smoking a cigar and watching his favorite sitcom. At other points, I would see my mother in the kitchen, making us dinner. These corporal fragments from a time long since past, they kept me going. After work, the house felt like home again. Until one day, I had just arrived home from work when it happened. I sat down on my dad's favorite chair and flipped onto the TV to unwind. Something crossed my mind, minus the tobacco. I had actually become my father. This thought put a bit of a smile on my face as I reclined the chair to relax. Relaxation never came though, as an all too familiar scratching sound emanated from the nearby pantry. My smile quickly vanished. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen to investigate. The scratching continued and increased in volume. I stared at the door hoping an answer would just jump out at me, but also hoping whatever was inside wouldn't do the same. Without many options at my disposal, I was forced to open it. Much with my anticipation, the noise ceased, and I found nothing behind the door but some empty shelves and an old broom. This was the same thing that happened when my mother opened the door many years ago. I was no longer a frightened child, but the sound's return was still unnerving. At least, it was at first. After a while, it became nothing more than a bothersome fixture in my otherwise normal days. Whenever I came home from work, woke up in the middle of the night, or sat down to watch television, that terrible scratching would invade my ear space, not stopping until I opened that damn pantry door. This routine continued for over a year. One night, however, everything changed. I had just gotten home from a long day of work and flung myself into the comfort of my bed sheets. I wanted more than anything to drift off into a peaceful slumber, hoping the day's troubles would melt away in the form of happy dreams and restful sleep. Unfortunately for me, the moment my head hit the pillow, the scratching started up once more. I groaned in anger, not wanting to leave my bed for anything, much less that damn noise. Because of this, I made the mistake of not getting up right away. I hit my internal snooze button and allowed myself to drift off for a few moments. When I came to, something was amiss. I didn't notice it at first, but the unsettling silence made way for a startling revelation. The scratching had stopped. How strange. It's never stopped on its own before. Perplexed, I jumped out of bed and ventured downstairs to investigate. What I saw upon entering the kitchen alarmed me. The pantry door was wide open. That can't be. It was definitely closed when I got home earlier. Turning on the light only revealed the usual empty shelves. It wasn't until my hand met the wood of the door that I noticed something unusual. Embedded in the hard oak were deep gashes, claw marks that covered the entire bottom half of the door. Those weren't there before. What the hell is going on? My childhood was beginning to catch up with me. Memories of the pantry came bursting through the floodgates. The scratches, the nightmares, the fear. But I wasn't a child this time, and I wasn't going to let a superstition get the better of me. It was just a raccoon or a larger rat. That's all. At least, that's what I told myself. I scoured the house for nearly an hour, ignoring my fast-beating heart the whole time. Whatever escaped from the pantry was nowhere to be found. As I stepped back into the kitchen to close the door and call it a night, something stopped me in my tracks. A shadowy figure raced across my field of vision and into the pantry. Slam! The pantry door shut on its own, shaking the walls around it. A bone-chilling vibration reverberated throughout the entire house in an instant, and was then followed by an eerily dead silence. My heart sank into my bowels. I was officially rattled. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find and piled them in front of the door, including my dad's old chair. Once satisfied with my blockade, I raced upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and jumped underneath my sheets. I was a kid again, scared shitless of the monster living in my mom's pantry. After the fear and adrenaline tapered off, I managed to get a little bit of rest. My late-night adventure had come to an end. I woke up the next morning in denial, a defense mechanism of a mind bruised by fear. Pretending nothing happened the previous night, I went about my morning routine as normal. After breakfast, I was able to walk right past the pile of crap in front of the pantry door without flinching. I even ignored the scratch marks on my front door as I left for work. Everything was fine. There was no monster, no supernatural entity taking over my home. That was absurd. It was just a raccoon, a very large raccoon. The lies only lasted for so long. Driving away, the terror set back in, sending me into a desperate frenzy of distress and unease. Though distracted by my strange predicament, I managed to make it to work in one piece. Work brought me no solace. All I could think about was what awaited me at home. I was on the edge, and my boss noticed this. He asked if I needed to leave early and get some rest. I practically shouted the word no at him, begging him to let me stay. I wanted to be away from that house as long as I could. Though confused by my unorthodox behavior, my boss obliged. I might have been able to stay at work, but I had to clock out eventually. The day went by far too quickly, and before I knew it, I was back home, sitting in my driveway, dreading the thought of opening the front door. Because of this, I sat in my car for a while, attempting to come up with a plan of action. What do I do? Who can I tell? Where will I stay? The question swirled around my tired mind until I shut my eyes and took a deep breath to relax. The weariness caught up with me in this moment, causing me to drift off in a stress-induced coma of sorts. I woke up a few hours later to the terrifying sight of scratch marks on my driver's side window. That was the last straw. That's it, I proclaimed out loud. I wasn't going to let this thing control my life, and I certainly wasn't going to let it drive me out of my own home. This is where I grew up, where I spent my childhood with my mother and father. They were still with me, the recollections scattered throughout the house, reminding me of who they were and the impact they had on my life. No amount of scratching was going to tear through the memories I had of them. Fed up, I got out of my car, walked up to the house, and swung the front door open. I was greeted with the sound of scratching, But this time, it was louder than it had ever been before. As I stormed over to the kitchen, the noise morphed into a thunderous banging at the pantry door, causing the stuff I piled in front of it to move a bit. Whatever was inside really wanted to get out this time. Adrenaline coursed through my veins. My fight or flight response was begging me to run, but it was too late. I had already made up my mind. I was going to face this thing head on and get to the bottom of the mystery. This was my home, after all. It belonged to me and my family, not whatever this thing was. In removing the stack of furniture, the banging continued to grow louder. The kitchen cabinets around me swung open. Various pots and pans fell off the shelves. An earthquake of supernatural proportions filled my home. But I didn't allow it to rattle me. I knew what I had to do. After a moment of mental preparation, I opened the pantry door. There, sitting behind the door, was a dog. It sat there and looked up at me in confusion. I did the same to it. After giving me a once-over, it walked over to me and nuzzled up against my leg. I instinctively reached down and pet it, as I would any dog. But this wasn't any dog. After a few moments of getting to know each other, it walked back into the pantry and vanished before my very eyes. It was a ghost. My fear completely dissipated after that day. I now come home to the sound of scratching and smile. I no longer open the pantry door in fear, but instead, to let my new friend out. He walks around the house, exploring, just like a normal dog would. He even sits down and watches TV with me from time to time. He's a bit shy though, vanishing whenever I have company over. Still, he is a good dog, a very good dog. I assume he belonged to one of the many owners of the house, seeing as it had been built long before my parents moved in. I guess he just couldn't let the place go. Neither could I. After a few weeks of bonding, I realized that I didn't have anything to call him by. I walked over to the little guy and pet him on the back of his neck. That was his favorite spot. I thought about it for a moment, and then came up with the perfect name. I will call you Monster.